All right, guys, welcome back to the No Switch Fitness YouTube page. Really excited about this video we're going to kind of be going over with you today. We're going to be going over Olivia's push day. But just to kind of kick us off, Olivia's going to kind of talk to you guys about where our head's at with like the competitive year this year. And then we're going to go from there.
Yeah, so as you probably know from now, I was prepping for a figure competition back in the summer and pulled out due to a lot of different reasons that I've gone over before. But we kind of shifted focus into going into WPD, spent some time pushing for growth, which was going to be necessary regardless of the division. And just based on a few different factors, decided that it's just going to be best to stick with figure. I think it just fits my lifestyle overall a lot better and my overall physique foundation. So just shifting focus with that. We still have some areas to bring up, with shoulders definitely being a big part of that. So today we're just going to go over a push session. And from a timeline perspective, we've talked about competing next spring. So we have a little bit of time, about a year, to continue pushing for growth. So just making sure that we fine tune training in the meantime, address any issues that come up is going to be super important within that timeline.
Yeah, and I think that kind of transitioning into the session, like one of the biggest things is prepping you for sessions, right? Like being able to kind of move the prep work according to how the shoulder is feeling with some of the previous like shoulder injuries just from like swimming overuse. And I think that we've kind of got a setup right now that's like walking you through some scapular motion fairly well to kind of set you up for the session. So we're just going to transition to that. You can kind of let them know like what are we doing? How's it helping with the session? And then we'll kind of dive in from there.
Yeah. So one thing about living at a distance now, before you and I were in the same city, so I could, tell you if I was having an issue, but communication's been so much more important during this time, because it's like, hey, my shoulder's hurting. It's like, okay, but what does that mean? And what is the underlying issue here? And just been having some issues in my like anterior delt, and I noticed a few things kind of coming into that. Potentially sleeping on my side and constantly having this shoulder like rounded forward on top of me, noticing that I was waking up feeling really bound up here, and then going from that to sitting at a computer like this all day. And before, where I had just been feeling some issues in the rear delt area, now I'm starting to feel it in the front. And so we kind of are attacking it from a different angle now. And I've noticed a lot of improvement in the session since doing that. And a huge part of that's been like this priming work that we've added in within the last couple of weeks.
Yep. And I think that kind of, we start with just some basic movement throughout the scap range. So like the scap push-ups just going to be retraction, protraction, moving you through that range, getting some scapular movement around, kind of waking up the serratus, like, hey, like we need to kind of get going and move in. And then we kind of go into the serratus overhead reach, which is just the elevation and rotation portion of just some scapular movement. So this is simply like gaining access to scapular movement, making sure the shoulder girdle has like full movement capacity. And then we talked about quite a few things that we've added in since the last time. Those two being more staples within the session, just kind of getting you moving. And we can kind of let you walk through some of those things that we've added since then.
Yeah, so we added, after the scap push-ups and the overhead reach, the prone swimmers, which is a super humbling movement. we said you can take some 5 pounds. No, I couldn't even do it. So I did it without weights. And just being in that plane was really hard to move in. And when you're prone like that, you can't really use a lot of extra movement to try to gain that access. So it's really challenging, but it definitely showed me some limitations that I have that makes sense why I would be having trouble in a session. And I think with warm-ups, we think about like, oh, I'll just like warm up with that same exercise at lighter weights. And it's like, yeah, but if you've been sitting all day like this, as like most of us are doing, how are you going to then jump into a session and be able to access safely an overhead position and be able to progress weights within that position? So spending a little bit more time doing this kind of work where we're getting into that overhead position safely, and with an active range of motion, I think has been really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And this has been a really hard but helpful movement to get into that position.
Yeah, and then two, we don't have videoed are going to be that high exposure cable curl, right? And then some sessions doing like that single arm cable pullover for that overhead access. More so just taking us through that range of external rotation with the high exposure cable curl and testing to see how much access we need to gain or if we're in a spot where it's good. And then just like some overhead head access with the single arm cable pullover where we're eccentrically loading that lat, eccentrically loading that teres to gain some overhead access. And then kind of wrapping it up is that kettlebell bottom under press. How have you been liking that as like the last thing to transition you into the session?
I really like it because it's not only being able to get into that overhead position, but also we've talked a lot about not like arching up and lifting the rib cage. And since my second movement, like main movement for this workout is a shoulder press, being able to make sure that I can access that position without arching up is really important before I get into the session.
Yeah, and I think that proper preparation prevents poor performance is probably the biggest like takeaway here. It's like, hey, your prep work may not have to look this extensive, right? You may not have a shoulder injury, but we need to be doing something to get the entire shoulder girdle prepped for what's to come. And I think that that's kind of where we need to move people in the bodybuilding realm is like, hey, like I know this sounds like fluff work, but it's going to improve our capacity to perform and output and drive hypertrophy overall. But now we get to the session, the fun part, the actual training, right? So we're kicking it off with a cable lateral. You kind of want to go over what you're doing here, driving cues, things like that.
Yeah, so with this cable lateral, one thing we've talked about is the setup of it and setting up that cable where for me it ends up being about mid shin so that I catch tension in the delt about 2 to 3 inches off the pull. I being able to engage the delt in that position really helps me getting into my presses after that point. I feel like I get a lot of tension in the delt there,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than like a dumbbell raise because of where I'm feeling it and how that delt is engaging throughout the movement. And then also thinking about like that slight internal rotation at the shoulder there and driving up slightly in front of my body has been really helpful, a really helpful cue to get more lateral delt engagement because that is definitely an area that I struggle to connect with.
Yeah, all that cable lateral, it's really easy to start like letting that trap pull you into retraction and start bringing it out to the side because that of the direction that cable is pulling. And so I think that that's really important to drive when we look at that. And like if we watch the video, you can see directionally, like the direction of your arm heading from that front view is like pretty much perfectly where we want that finishing point. Because we start going much further, we're going to be going into that trap access area, right? So it's a great way to start. I'm a big fan of starting push days with a lateral of some sort. I think that this variation, like you said, is allowing you to get a lot of tension, a lot out of that lateral delt before you head into pressing, which is the next movement on deck.
Yeah, so with this shoulder press, one adjustment we've made lately, and it's kind of a series of adjustments, but I scoot my hips forward now and kind of contract my core and keep my rib cage down throughout the movement. And that helps me to create a little bit more power and it's not as strict of an overhead position. So I'm not having to externally rotate as much because I don't really have that access. And I've been able to increase the weight pretty consistently on that while still getting a lot of tension through the front delt here.
Yeah, and foot pressure was one we talked about too, right?
Yeah, and just having that in mind with all pressing movements from here on out, it's just allow me to brace a lot more effectively and just set up more consistently. Because if I wasn't thinking about foot position before on my pressing movements, and now it's like that's such a huge part of my setup because I'm able to, with my hips a little bit forward, pushing my feet into the floor and driving my upper back into the pad. I'm really locked in and secure, and it doesn't feel like I'm shifting as much throughout the movement.
Which, from a shoulder safety perspective and an output perspective, is going to be a dual benefit, right? So definitely something to kind of look into based on your shoulder. This machine does have a slightly cylindrical cam, so this setup is very, very, very good for some of her shoulder access issues and just the directionally how this press works. And I think it's something that almost across the board, some variation of that setup needs to be used depending on the machine that's kind of like being in place. So, and then like after that, you kind of address the lateral raise, and we know that shoulders is a very, very primary portion of this improvement season. So we're just going to keep moving with like the shoulder volume and into a third shoulder exercise, which I think is IG worthy with this handle here. Yeah.
So I actually hooked up like the TRX band to a cable machine, and I really like it because you're having to pull the actual straps apart as you raise, which to me just it feels like a completely different stimulus than just like a lateral raise with the cable or with dumbbells. And a big key with this one, I found I did have my legs straight out in front of me, but I found that I was like arching up throughout the movement. So I bent my knees, really like contracted down slightly, like lift my head in order to prevent that, like where I start to externally rotate a lot throughout the movement and I can keep the tension in the lateral delts a bit more.
And what a lot of people don't think of is like having those feet up like that or those knees bent with your feet into the floor will help you with a counter force with the cable trying to pull you back towards that cable. So it's another thing that's going to help you prevent that like expansion into and really opening up and arching and pulling trap heavily into it. And just like this setup and execution is so ideal. But for those who don't have like a TRX thing lying around, there's a couple different ways that you guys could set it up. How did you used to set this up when you were back here at Destination?
Yeah, we've done it with cables. So on a like sitting back on an incline bench and having the cables on the with the bilateral arms
Yep.
and being able to pull like that same thing where you would lock down so you're not arching back throughout the movement. Um, I liked that setup as well. It takes a little bit more time. So this one was cool to be able to set up in this position, but obviously not everyone has this equipment or even this much room, like a full turf to be able to set up like a 5 foot setup and cause a scene in the middle of the gym. So there are definitely different ways to do this.
Yeah, and I think that cable setup's probably the best way that you can set it up, just because like with both you have rather good freedom of movement in order to pull across the path that your body wants you to for that lateral delt. And so that, I think that's the concept that you would be trying to get across is basically making sure that you're able to have that as you're going into that wide raise. Moving forward into the session, we got some changes that we kind of pulled out based off of this. If you kind of want to walk through some of those changes before we head into the next movement.
Yeah, so we did next have an incline chest press machine. And while I do like this movement a lot, just with all this like being so bound up, we pulled that out just to reduce the amount of pressing volume there. And I really hesitated with that because my thought was, this is a push day. Like, why not have two pushing movements? And my old like volume addict self started screaming from the inside. But since we pulled it out, I've actually felt a lot better in the shoulder with the priming work and with a little bit less pressing volume. And I feel like I'm able to then recover for my next push session, since I do have two, a little bit better than trying to just add in more pressing volume when it's not needed. And with the goal transition from WPD to figure, we can sacrifice a little bit of chest volume. So having pulled that out, it's like you have to look at the risk reward here, and it has allowed me to push harder in that second push session without the shoulder discomfort from extra pushing volume. And we also removed reverse pec deck because, like I mentioned, I was having a lot of pain in the like rear portion of my shoulder. And that's a lot of residual issues from where I had shoulder surgery before. So we pulled out the reverse pec deck, and I have felt a lot better with both of those movements out. We still have a lot of rear delt volume in my pull days, and I've found that seems to be working well without needing to keep that movement in.
Yeah, which is something to consider, right? Especially if you have recurring shoulder issues like working that rear delt plane when we're pretty much already training that rear delt plane in most pulling. For a lot of people, that's a great place to have it. And I think the point there is like programming is meant to sequence performance from session to session. It's not about doing everything in that one session. And so that was like one of the big things, like as far as like breaking through for what could probably arguably slightly an overuse issue with a couple other things layered in on top of it. Really allowed us to move forward and kind of go into the next pattern where we're able to continue this session.
And then after we go through all the shoulder movements, we transition to some tricep work.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have an overhand push down here, and I've swapped that out for a rope push down. With this, I don't feel the need to have to stabilize as much in with that like rear delt where I'm feeling the issue there. So being able to open my chest up and stay a little bit more locked down without having to like force myself into that lockdown position has been helpful to just prevent aggravating that. And this is one where I would highly recommend using the long rope or doing two ropes pulled out to the ends here, because I just feel like the alignment's so much better than trying to use a short rope.
Yeah, that short rope pulls you in some pretty excessive internal rotation, right? And for most of us, we're larger bodied individuals when it comes to the amount of muscle we have. So having that longer rope will allow us to kind of have that alignment be where we want it in order to have that retraction and slight depression to hold the shoulder joint in place. So definitely a great pattern. Definitely something a little bit specific to the swap from overhand into that, just so that we can keep the shoulder joint in a bit of a better spot. And then kind of wrap up the push day with the last movement.
So lastly, went into these cable tricep crossovers. And this is one where I do have to stabilize a bit more to stay in the right position. But because it's not such a heavy movement, I don't get that discomfort in the rear delt area.
Yeah.
This was a school crusher setup before, and with that overhead tricep work, it was just like I was running into issues with everything that I've mentioned before. So my ego took a little bit of a hit pulling out that overhead work, but it has helped a lot. And I think that's a huge lesson I've learned throughout this growth phase is like you cannot just continue to force yourself into positions that are uncomfortable if it's an actual structural problem. You're not going to gain like muscular development just from like being hardcore and pushing through it. Like you need to stop and address whatever issue is going on so that you can move forward with more stability after that point once you're able to access it more effectively. And you can still progress and develop muscle even if you're not accessing certain positions well. Just make sure that that priming work is in place so that you can continue to make progress in that position. You're not just completely avoiding it, but you're not necessarily overloading in that position.
Yep, 100%. I think that's the key, is like the goal should be to eventually move back to being able to do something there. Although it may not be an overloaded position for a very long period of time in the program. So, Olivia, I think that was a great overview of kind of like this session and like the kind of the goal with like where we're headed with going into figure with spring next year. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we kind of log off and move forward?
No, I think that's about it. We'll definitely be going over sessions in the future and any like adjustments we make to things. Because again, we want to progress these movements in some of these positions. So we can walk through some more training programs as well as adjustments to the program moving forward, since we have quite a bit of time to continue pushing for growth.
Yep, 100%. Well, guys, thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you guys like and subscribe to the channel. Comment on the video below with any questions you guys may have. Both Olivia and I will be down there answering questions for any of you guys that have them. Until next time, no off switch in pursuit of results.